Legislative leaders are going to walk you through those numbers. We take you live to St. Paul.
Forecasts, and the forecasts represent the best financial projections that we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. In this forecast, we'll continue to refine our projections for fiscal years 26 and 27, which will provide essential information that policymakers can use in any supplemental budget considerations. We also update our projections for the planning years FY 28 and 29. After our presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions. There is good news in this forecast, but significant risks do remain. Minnesota is in a strong financial position. We now project to end fiscal years 26-27 with a surplus of $3.7 billion, which is $1.3 billion more than forecast in November. Left unspent, that surplus will carry forward into fiscal years 28 and 29. Those funds carrying forward are key to ending the planning years with a positive balance. As a result, we're currently forecasting a $377 million positive balance in FY 28 and 29. The increased projected balance in both biennia is due to a slightly improved national economic outlook, which drives an increase in forecast revenues, particularly in individual income tax and corporate franchise taxes. When it comes to individual income taxes, we're seeing a shift from typical drivers of revenue increases, like wage and salary, to more volatile sources. Higher wages and more people in the workforce traditionally drive increases in revenue to individual income taxes. And wages do, in fact, continue to rise. However, employment growth is weak, both nationally and in Minnesota, and demographics and changing immigration policies are shrinking the pool of available workers. Instead, what we're seeing now is capital gains and interest earnings, which are sensitive to even small changes in the national economic outlook, propel much of the increase in the individual income tax revenues. As Minnesota becomes more reliant on these revenue sources, we're also seeing and should expect increased volatility. As we've discussed in previous forecasts, we also have seen unprecedented growth in our corporate tax revenues. And while this is generally good news, it's worth noting this has long been our most volatile revenue source. Dr. Becker will discuss this in more detail, but the lack of access to relevant federal data due to the federal government shutdown does have potential implications for our revenue forecast, particularly when it comes to our most volatile revenue sources. In Minnesota, we're also experiencing unprecedented threats to federal funding that we rely on. Any loss of federal funding is problematic, but particularly for entitlements, which would result in significantly increased costs to the state to provide legally required services without benefit of federal aid. The potential implications for the Minnesota budget should not be underestimated. And the structural imbalance, or the amount that spending exceeds revenues, continues to be an issue both in this biennium and the next, and that's even after the improvements to the revenue forecast. I do want to note that the significant actions taken by the governor and the legislature last spring in the enacted FY 26-27 budget have helped drive a positive balance in FY 28 and 29. And while the structural imbalance was not eliminated, it is improved in part due to those budget decisions. This slide shows a projected FY 26-27 budgetary balance for this forecast in the middle column compared to the November estimates on the left. The column furthest to the right shows the difference between the two. At the top of the slide, you'll see that our beginning balance for the current biennium is nearly $10.3 billion. That money represents carry forward from the last biennium. Our revenue estimates for the current biennium are up about $1.2 billion from the November forecast, and spending projections are down $68 million. The projected balance at the end of fiscal years 26 and 27 appears under the lowest horizontal line. As you can see, we now forecast a positive balance of more than $3.7 billion, again, nearly $1.3 million than we had forecasted in November. This slide should look familiar. It shows the forecast horizon and the impacts of one biennium on the next. Before I get into the contents of this slide, it's important to remember that when we started this current biennium in July, we had the benefit of significant carry forward from FY 24 and 25 of $4.8 billion. This is important because we do have a structural imbalance in the biennium that we're currently in of $908 million. That starting balance, less the structural imbalance, leaves us with a projected balance of $3.7 billion. If we look at the screen, I'll start on the column in dark blue to the left. This is showing the $3.7 billion we project to be available at the end of FY 26-27. Left unspent, that money carries forward to become the beginning balance in fiscal years 28 and 29. If we move to the middle column in bold, you can see the projected structural imbalance in FY 28 and 29 of just under $3.4 billion. This is the amount the projected spending exceeds revenues generated in that biennium, plus discretionary inflation of over $1 billion. When you subtract that sum from the $3.7 billion, we're left with what you see in the dark blue column on the right, $377 million at the end of fiscal years 28 and 29. Discretionary inflation is included in the forecast to give policymakers a sense of what it would cost to maintain state services at the current level. If we don't count discretionary inflation, which is a reminder legislators are not required to budget for, we'd have a projected positive balance of slightly more than $1.4 billion at the end of the planning years. With that, I'd like to invite State Economist Dr. Anthony Becker to the podium to cover our economic and revenue outlook.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Anthony Becker, Minnesota State Economist. Since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was last prepared in November 2025, the U.S. economic outlook has improved slightly, with higher rates of growth in real gross domestic product, consumer expenditures, and investment, along with a forecast for slightly lower rates of inflation in the near term. However, payroll growth has weakened and trade policy uncertainty continues to cloud the economic outlook. Our macroeconomic consultant, S&P Global Market Intelligence, SPGMI, released their baseline forecast to us on February 6, 2026. Due to the federal government shutdown in October and November and the partial shutdown in early February, certain key data that are typically available for SPGMI's February forecast were not available to them. The data include fourth quarter gross domestic product and its components, corporate profits, and the January 2026 employment situation report. Also missing are consumer prices from October of 2025. On trade, SPGMI assumed an effective tariff rate of 14%, 4 percentage points lower than in November. The recent Supreme Court decision invalidating the IEEPA tariffs happened after SPGMI's forecast release, as did the 10% Section 122 tariffs that the administration announced. In this chart, we have SPGMI's forecast for GDP through the end of the forecast horizon. Here, the overall outlook has improved since November, with higher growth in 25 and slightly higher growth in 26, mostly due to an assumption that strong economic growth in quarters 3 and 4 of 25 would carry forward into 2026. As in November, GDP growth, though, remains below trend in 2027 and beyond. This means that employment demand is unlikely to be robust in the years ahead. Further, a low-growth economy can more easily slip into recession as a result of an adverse external shock. Real personal consumption expenditures, also known as real consumer spending, are the primary driver of growth in the economy, accounting for roughly 70% of GDP. SPGMI now forecasts real consumer spending will grow 2.8% in 2026, 0.7 of a percentage point higher than their November forecast. From 2027 through 2029, real consumer spending is expected to grow 2.2% per year on average. Despite rising incomes, we are observing some signs of consumer stress with higher delinquency rates in certain loans, credit cards, auto loans, and student loans, with delinquency rates now reaching levels comparable to those during the Great Recession. However, home loan delinquency rates remain at historic lows. Compared to the November forecast, inflation is projected to be slightly lower in 2026 and higher from 2027 to 29. Lower near-term inflation reflects a lower assumed average effective tariff rate than in the November forecast, and lower inflation that we experienced in late 2025. Overall, inflation in both the CPI and core personal consumption expenditure indices is expected to remain elevated through 2027 before gradually easing in 2028. Corporate profits are now forecast to grow 9.5% in fiscal year 2026, 7.4 percentage points stronger than projected in November. In FY27 and beyond, corporate profits are forecast to show minimal growth. Minnesota's corporate franchise tax is closely related to the level of corporate profits and is the state's most volatile revenue source. The volatility in this revenue source makes it difficult to forecast with precision. Minnesota's unemployment rate has continued to increase over the past year, both absolutely and relative to the national rate. In December, Minnesota's unemployment rate was 4.1%, up 1.1 percentage points from a rate of 3.0% 1 year ago. Although the unemployment rate has risen, Minnesota's rate remains below the national rate, and the state's job market remains favorable to job seekers, with more vacancies than unemployed workers. While this forecast does not include a recession, we are following labor market conditions closely, as some labor market indicators send early signals of economic contractions and expansions. Traditionally, a significant driver of our individual income tax forecast is the forecast for total wage and salary disbursements, and it is little changed since the November forecast. In this forecast, though, wage income is not what is driving the change in the individual income tax forecast. Rather, the increase is driven by increases in non-wage income, principally in capital gains distributions. SPGMI's forecast of the S&P 500 stock index is one determinant of our forecast for non-wage income. Their February forecast is substantially higher than their November forecast for the S&P 500. In November, they projected a 12% multi-year downward correction in the S&P 500, with the market declining through late 2028. But in the current forecast, they assume a milder correction of only 4% and recovery beginning in 2027. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks to the forecast. If equity markets continue their current upward trends, we will see greater levels of consumer spending and higher non-wage income, both of which will increase state revenues. On the other hand, if we see a substantial decrease in market values of equities, both income and spending would likely fall. So turning to the revenue forecast, the first two columns of the table show the February forecast for the current biennium and the change compared to the November forecast. The second set of columns show the same information for the next biennium. Total revenues for the current biennium are now forecast to be $68 billion, 1.8% more than in the November forecast. We're now projecting individual income tax receipts to be 1.9% more than we projected in November. This increase is primarily due to higher forecasts for individual income tax liability in tax years 25 and 26. The higher tax liability forecast is largely driven by higher forecasts for non-wage income sources, such as capital gains realization, interest income, and IRA distributions. Through January 26, individual estimated tax payments for tax year 25 are $165 million above our November forecast, which is consistent with a higher tax year 2025 liability. Technical adjustments and a higher forecast for net partnership and S corporation collections further contribute to the forecast change. And this is also consistent with stronger collections we've observed through January of this year. General sales tax revenue is now forecast to be nearly $16 billion, 0.5% more than in the current biennium than in the November forecast. This increased forecast reflects a higher forecast for consumer spending on goods and services subject to the sales tax. The corporate franchise tax is forecast to generate $6.6 billion in the current biennium, 5.4% more revenue than in the November forecast. This forecast change is due to the higher corporate profits forecast as shown previously. Other revenues are now forecast to generate almost $10 billion, 1.2% more than in November, due primarily to an increased forecast for investment income, the return the state earns on its cash balances, including the budget reserve. As I noted previously, higher forecasts for non-wage income sources are primary drivers of the higher individual income tax forecast. The non-wage share of gross income reported by Minnesota taxpayers has been increasing over time, and we expect this trend to continue. Non-wage income, such as capital gains and interest income, are more variable from year to year than wage and salary income. With a rising proportion of personal income tax coming from more volatile sources, the overall volatility of income tax collections has increased. Further, over time, the proportion of general fund revenues coming from more volatile corporate tax, franchise tax, has also risen. This adds volatility to the state's revenue collections in total. To turn to forecast risks. First among the risks to this forecast are the policy uncertainties at the federal level, especially regarding trade, tariffs, and immigration. Trade uncertainty may induce businesses and consumers to take on less debt, suppressing both private investment and some forms of consumer spending. Tariffs are mostly passed through to domestic buyers and so also contribute to higher prices and higher input costs for businesses. The administration's immigration policies also produce forecast risk through the potential to create labor shortages in business sectors dependent on immigration for new workers. The recent federal shutdown disrupted the usual collection and dissemination of federal statistical data. The missing data due to the shutdown clouds our picture of economic growth, corporate profits, inflation, and labor market conditions, adding uncertainty to our revenue forecast. It also makes it more difficult to assess the reasonableness of SPGMI's forecasts of inflation and exchange rates. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks, as I've already mentioned. The assumed path of monetary policy depends on both inflation and labor market conditions. Because of the trade uncertainty and weak national employment growth, there's limited clarity about monetary policy through the forecast horizon. The adoption of artificial intelligence provides both upside and downside risks. The upside or positive risk is that through more capital investment, we'll see increased labor productivity, higher wages, and possibly higher employment. The downside risks include the possibility of job losses from AI adoption and the risk that there is an AI investment bubble which may burst. Finally, there are 17 months remaining until the end of the current biennium, and it's difficult to forecast macroeconomic conditions with great precision a year and a half ahead. That ends my portion of the presentation, so I will now turn things over to our State Budget Director, Anna Mingi.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Mingi, State Budget Director at Minnesota Management and Budget. Today, I will be walking through changes in the state expenditure forecast, and then I'll turn it to the Commissioner who will walk through our long-term budget outlook. So this slide outlines anticipated changes in general fund spending in the current biennium as well as our planning years of 2028 and 2029. In total, we project that spending in the current biennium will be $68 million lower than our previous estimates, but the planning estimates have increased by $152 million since our last forecast. Let me walk you through the table to give a better sense of what's driving that change. The first line, E12 education, spending is above prior estimates by $111 million this biennium and $257 million in the next. These increases are a result of higher spending for special education, where costs have grown as school districts spend more to deliver services to our students. Health and Human Services spending is projected to be $162 million below previous estimates this biennium and $199 million lower in the next. This reduction is largely driven by the implementation of new payment review processes in the medical assistance program, which I will discuss in greater detail in a moment. On the next line, you can see the property tax aids and credits spending is $18 million below previous estimates in this biennium, largely as a result of lower spending on property tax refunds. Spending for debt service and all other areas of the budget are virtually unchanged from previous estimates. On the next line, you can see that our forecast includes an estimate of discretionary inflation. We estimate this cost to be $1.04 billion, which is $104 million more than we forecast in November. This change is due to a slightly higher forecast for the Consumer Price Index, which can have a large budgetary impact because it's applied on such a large base of spending. As a reminder, this number is not meant to be a specific accounting every single inflationary pressure in the budget. Rather, it is a guide for policymakers about the cost of maintaining current services as prices grow. Any increases need to be appropriated by the legislature. They don't automatically flow to state programs unless the program has a specific statutory formula that directs it. So policymakers have the choice of whether or not to spend this line item to address those inflationary pressures. So now let's move on to the next slide to discuss some key changes within our spending forecast. As you just heard, special ed is responsible for the upward revision in our education forecast. These costs have increased by $112 million this biennium and $350 million in the next relative to where we were in November. That is on top of the significant increases that we incorporated in the November forecast of $133 million in 26-27 and $287 million in 2028 and 2029. Today's increases are because we now have complete data about what schools spent on special ed services in the 2024-25 school year. Special ed service spending grew by about 10% last year compared to the 6% that we assumed would grow in the previous forecast. The annual rate of growth for school special ed spending has grown significant in recent years, driving revisions in the state forecast. So the chart on this slide shows actual and forecast state general fund special ed spending from 2020 through 2029. During this time period, we project that special ed spending is projected to grow from $1.6 billion in 2020 to $3.6 billion in 2029. When you look at that on an annual growth perspective, from 2020 through 2023, state general fund spending on special ed grew about 5% on average annually, but from 25 through 29, that rate grows to about 9.5% a year. Some of these changes can be attributed to legislative changes that affect special ed, but overall growth in local education agency spending continues to rise forecast over forecast. And that's really evident on this slide when you look at the previous forecast that we have marked in those dotted and dashed lines. You can see from the end of the 2023 legislative session is the bottom line, then the end of the 2025 legislative session, and finally November 2025 session. So in each of these cases, we've revised our forecast upward to account for higher actual spending sort of at the local level. Now let's move on and talk about a driver of the change in the human services forecast. So this forecast is the first to incorporate the experience that we have with the new prepayment review process for certain medical assistance benefits. In late October 2025, the Minnesota Department of Human Services announced a new process to suspend and review claims for 14 high-risk Medicaid benefits. This was intended to give the agency additional time to identify suspicious patterns and anomalies. DHS contracted with a third party for this review and has established an ongoing prepayment review process for these services. This process has impacted the forecast in 3 ways, which are sort of depicted in the chart on the screen. So what the chart shows is the forecast savings attributable to the prepayment review process. The most immediate impact, in the dark blue on the slide, is the delay in the payment of fee-for-service claims of 2 weeks. This additional review takes time, and as a result, the claims are paid just 1 billing cycle later than they would have otherwise. And because everything is pushed out by 2 weeks, there is just a one-time savings reflected in the forecast. But the most significant impact of the prepayment review process comes from the fact that we are receiving fewer bills from providers. Some have referred to this as cost avoidance. Through an analysis of claims from both before and during the implementation of prepayment review, DHS estimates about 4% lower spending in these 14 services as a result of providers simply billing less. This cost avoidance is expected to decrease state spending by $75 million this biennium and $99 million in the next. This estimate is based on actual experience in the most recent quarter, and it's not an explicit measure of fraud. It may indicate that there's a deterrent effect of the new prepayment review process, but it might also be capturing savings related to broader conditions in both the service delivery sector or the broader economy. The third forecast impact of the prepayment review process is the denial of claims that would have been otherwise paid if not for the review. In this process, claims for the impacted benefits are reviewed using targeted analytics and then flagged if suspicious. So if a claim is identified for further review, it's sent to DHS staff who reviews it and decides either to approve or deny. Based on early data, DHS projects an increase in denials, which reduces state spending by $5 to $6 million a biennium. So in total, the incorporation of this experience lowers the spending forecast by $133 million this biennium and $105 million in the next. So now let's move on and talk about something that is not in the forecast. So as we've discussed in previous forecasts, federal funds are a very important piece of the state budget. Federal funds make up about 1 in every $3 spent by state agencies. What MMB pays particular attention to, though, are federal funds that support state-level entitlements, programs where the state has an obligation under our laws to provide service to individuals regardless of federal funding levels. We estimate these dollars make up about 2/3 of the funds we receive from the federal government. In these cases, losses of federal funds create a direct budgetary impact to the state. Federal funding for entitlement programs has been more volatile in recent months as a result of both federal law changes and administrative action, and there are several risks that are not reflected in today's forecast. One example is related to actions taken by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, also referred to as CMS, which is the federal agency overseeing Medicaid. On January 6th, CMS indicated their intent to withhold $515 million per quarter from the state's MA reimbursement. That action is currently pending appeal, and the loss of federal funds is not reflected in our estimates today. And now, just earlier this week, we received additional notice from CMS that they would defer $260 million of our Medicaid reimbursements pending further information from the state to justify claims that they flagged. There is also budgetary risk from the fact that some of our state laws do not comply with federal law that passed over the summer. Specifically, H.R. 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill, made a number of changes, some of which must be implemented by January 1st of 2027. An example of that would be work reporting requirements for Medicaid. If state law is not amended to comply with this change, we stand to lose significant federal funds supporting this program. Unfortunately, we don't have the guidance today to quantify the magnitude of this risk, but we understand that it could be significant and could change our budget outlook. There have also been recent attempts by the federal government to freeze funds supporting child care benefits and MFIP. And although none of these impacts are currently reflected, if they occur, it could dramatically alter our current budget outlook. With that, I'll turn it back to Commissioner Campbell.
Thank you, Anna. This slide shows the long-term budget outlook. It compares our forecast revenues against our estimated spending for the current biennium and the next. And that's without including any unspent projected balances or transfers to the reserve. This is what we call our structural balance. As you can see, forecast revenues of $67.5 billion in the current biennium are expected to grow by $2.5 billion in the next, an annualized growth rate of 1.9%. During that same period, we are expecting baseline spending of $68.4 billion to increase by nearly $4 billion, or 2.9% on an annualized basis in the FY 28-29 biennium. If you include appropriation carry forward and discretionary inflation, total spending is projected to exceed $70.2 billion in this biennium, growing by $3.1 billion to a total of $73.4 billion in the planning years, an annualized growth rate of 2.2%. So if we take a step back, when we subtract total forecasted spending in the planning biennium from expected revenues in that same period, you end up with a structural imbalance of nearly $3.4 billion, or $2.3 billion if you don't include discretionary inflation. Despite tremendous progress in the last legislative session, more work is needed to address the ongoing structural imbalance to align revenues and spending. You can see on this slide how our budget reserves have grown over the years thanks to our nation-leading reserve policy. With the addition of $244 million last November, our total cash flow and budget reserve remains at a record high of $3.8 billion. Those reserve dollars not only protect us against an unexpected loss of revenues in the current biennium, they also help us maintain our AAA bond ratings and our reputation as a financially well-managed state. As I close, I want to reinforce that the state of Minnesota is on strong financial footing. We have a very healthy projected balance in FY 26-27 of nearly $3.7 billion on the bottom line. And despite persistent structural imbalances, we expect to end this biennium and the next with a positive balance. And that's a big improvement from November, particularly in FY 28 and 29. Additionally, we have our nation-leading automatic allocation to our reserve, which means that we have the funds to address an unexpected revenue shortfall. And just a note here that in light of Minnesota's increased dependence on more volatile revenue sources, there may be adjustments needed to the budget reserve target level to better capture those heightened risks in the future. We also have our AAA bond rating that demonstrates rating agencies' continued confidence in Minnesota's responsible financial management and our history of taking actions to keep the state on sound financial footing. And we also have time to address the structural changes needed to bring spending and revenue in line in order to avoid a future fiscal crisis. Still, it will be important for policymakers to keep a few things in mind as they make decisions this legislative session. First, the volatility of the revenue that's driving the forecast improvement. In particular, in light of the relevant macroeconomic data that did not arrive in time to be included in this forecast. Even the most recently released GDP and corporate profits data could have meaningful impacts on available revenues. As we've mentioned, continued federal funding uncertainty could have impacts on our general fund bottom line. And as we know, any new spending this biennium will impact the projected positive balance of $377 million in FY 28 and 29. And finally, structural imbalance does continue to be an issue. Alignment of spending and revenue will need to be addressed. The sooner we begin looking for additional ways to do that, the less likely we are to face a future fiscal cliff. Given these considerations, it's our recommendation that policymakers should, at a minimum, strongly consider offsetting any new spending with spending reductions to be mindful of both the FY 28-29 projected balance and the structural imbalance. I do want to once again acknowledge the important work done last legislative session that did have a material impact on this forecast. That fiscal discipline will remain important in this legislative session and the next. As always, MMB will continue to watch for significant changes through our monthly revenue updates, our quarterly economic updates, our close monitoring of federal actions, and we'll be providing that information to the legislature and to the public so that they can anticipate and respond to economic changes. And with that, we are happy to take your questions.